Welcome to Reducing Risk, a series of podcasts from Medical Protection created specifically for doctors in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Reducing Risk looks at key medical legal issues in our jurisdiction and provides helpful advice and guidance on how to manage those risks. Today's topic is, do I have to be a Good Samaritan? And what are my risks or obligations? So I'm going to start with a story. So you're on a plane and you're flying between Auckland and Dunedin, and you've been working right up to the minute you got on that plane, so you're pretty exhausted. You haven't had any alcohol, so you're completely sober. And then over the announcement system, you hear that dreaded phrase, "Is there a doctor on board? If so, please identify yourself to one of the cabin crew." Maybe you're a gynecologist or a psychiatrist and you're thinking, I'm not sure how much help I'm going to be. But you stand up and are ushered to the back of the plane where an unconscious person is lying in the aisle. Now, we're not going to give any medical advice on how to approach the situation here, but today I'm here with my friends and colleagues, Dr. Tim Cookson. Hi, Tim.
Hello.
And Dr. Sam King. And look, we're going to consider the medical legal issues in this scenario and others like it. We're actually going to split this subject into two podcasts. This first one is we're going to consider our obligations when we're in New Zealand. And then we're going to do the next podcast where we're going to look at what our obligations are or what might happen if we provide Good Samaritan care when we're overseas. Sam, Tim and I all work as medical legal consultants for Medical Protection Society, giving advice and support to members when they come across ethical, regulatory or medical legal issues. And today we're talking about a subject which we get quite a few questions about on our advice line. What's my obligation to help in an emergency? What if it's outside my scope of practice? Will my indemnity cover me if I make a mistake? Over the course of our lives, we're all likely to come across emergency situations outside our practice at some point. I know that I've personally come across several major road accidents where I've been the first medically trained person on the scene. And it can be very challenging being put in the role of the doctor when you don't have your equipment, you don't have your team or your resources, and you're actually in a medical situation that isn't quite within your normal scope of practice.
Yeah, and I think some of us may by instinct think, I can't help here, it's outside my scope and I won't stop. Certainly I've had that thought myself.
Yes, it was awfully tempting just to keep on driving, isn't it, rather than pulling up. But look, the Medical Council is very clear about the obligations on doctors in New Zealand, and in their statement on this, entitled A Doctor's Duty to Help in a Medical Emergency, it lays out our professional obligations, and it says you have an ethical obligation as a doctor to respond promptly if needed for a medical emergency. If you choose not to attend a medical emergency, you must be able to justify your decision.
So there is an out clause. And I also guess that this only actually applies to emergencies that occur in New Zealand. Our medical council surely doesn't have any jurisdiction on what we do when we're overseas.
No, that's right, they don't. And if you do end up attending an emergency overseas, different laws may apply. But it's not like you're going to be looking up the local law in Bangkok when you come across a tuk-tuk accident. So when you're overseas, we just suggest that you're guided by ethical principles.
Yeah, that certainly agrees with the Medical Council statement, which starts off by telling us that we must respond promptly if we're needed in a medical emergency, and that it's our ethical obligation to do so. Then they go through your out clauses, Lucy, and they outline some of the things that may give you reason not to have to attend. So they include if you're already attending another emergency. So you're thinking of the doctors, like the paediatricians who attended a lot of the injured patients in the Christchurch earthquake. They couldn't attend to one patient because they were already looking after an emergency. If it's more appropriate for an emergency service to attend. So if there's an ambulance about to arrive, then it may be better for you not to leap in and start CPR on someone who doesn't actually need CPR after all. If your geographical location is such that another doctor or medical service could attend more promptly, so if you're only 2 minutes from ED, you're probably better just to get the patient to ED quickly rather than to muck around on the side of the road. If you've recently consumed a substance such as alcohol or medication to a level where your clinical judgment or skill could be impaired or compromised. And the other risk, of course, with alcohol, as a policeman, I think, in Taranaki found out, was when he heard a crash very close to his home, but he'd been drinking. He drove a very short distance to the crash site. He assisted ably, but the other police who turned up realised that he was inebriated, and in fact he was charged with driving under the influence.
Oh, that's
which
tough,
was
isn't it?
Really tough, yes. So
I think part of the problem is that when you are inebriated, your judgment about how inebriated you are can be a little off.
really,
So I've been told.
of
I've
course,
never
we've
experienced
all-
that myself.
Exactly. Look, if attending the emergency puts your own personal safety at risk or puts your children at risk, then you can say you can't attend. And in any other situation, such as fatigue that Lucy was talking about, where your skills, judgment, or health may compromise your ability to respond appropriately to the medical emergency. So those are the sort of the get out clauses. But most of the time, you should assume you're expected to attend unless there's a really good reason why not.
Yeah, it's interesting, that skills one as well, isn't it? But look, the other issue is that whole, I'm on that plane from Auckland to Dunedin and I'm completely exhausted. Does that mean I don't have to stand up?
No, and particularly if there's no other doctor available, you do have a responsibility. If you've already had your 3 gin and tonics by the time the call came through, then you could say, look, I'm sorry, I'm not in a fit state to attend and assist. I don't know if you get 3 gin and tonics on the way from Auckland to...
So being tired doesn't, but being tired, actually, there's good evidence that impairs your performance, isn't it? But obviously we don't think
There
that.
is. Oh, well, if you think about it, a lot of the clinicians in the current, these days are exhausted, suffering from burnout. But I don't think the hospital system would cope if all the doctors
we said it,
suddenly
if-
walked off and
right.
said, no, I'm not fit to practice. So, Tim, am I taking it from you that if we don't want to be called on to help in a medical emergency during a flight, we should just start drinking as soon as we board the flight? Is that the message you're trying to give?
No, the message really is that you should preload properly. So it's before you get on the flight
I
that you
thought
need
Air
to.
New Zealand don't like that, do they? I think you might not even get on the plane if you do that.
No. And there may be some professional...
Yeah, you may find the medical council has another problem with your professionalism in that situation. Yeah, okay. We won't maybe go down that rabbit hole. Okay, so...
But the next question is, if we have an obligation to attend, what are our obligations at that point? What standards will we be held to? And if I'm a psychiatrist, what happens if I mismanage, say, a ruptured aortic aneurysm?
Okay, well, the Medical Council has actually considered that and has specified that we all do have different skills. And so for some doctors, their only obligation may be to provide basic first aid. I think psychiatrists are still expected to have some first aid knowledge. And even if you don't have the relevant skills, you should still assist where possible. And, there may be situations where 2 or 3 people with some skills are required. So, for example, if you come across a cardiac arrest, you're going to need several people who can provide the assistance. And even if the only thing that you're doing is chest compressions or whatever, you're still doing it to the best of your knowledge and ability.
There's an interesting bit of legislation about this because there aren't many situations similar, but the Health Practitioners Competence Assurance Act 2003 says that a registered doctor may provide help in an emergency even if they don't hold a current practicing certificate, or if the assistance is outside their registered scope of practice or outside any conditions of practice. So that means if you're working under supervision and your annual practicing certificate says you're working under the supervision of Dr. X, you actually can still provide emergency care without Dr. X being there. And if your scope of practice says you're only working, as a urgent care fellow, actually, well, maybe urgent care is probably not a good example, but, you can work outside your scope in the situation where you're attending an emergency. But it's interesting, you don't have to have a practicing certificate.
So a retired doctor, for example, would still have an ethical obligation to attend and assist?
I think they would, but interestingly, I don't think the Medical Council would have jurisdiction if they didn't, because they're not registered with the Medical Council anymore.
Yeah, would ACC apply if you create injuries, you fracture a few ribs while you're doing that chest compression? That would come under common assault.
It would
I don't think so. I think you have to be registered, don't you?
Yeah, but
ACC.
no, ACC would kick in from the point of view that there was an externally applied force. So it'd be like any other regular accident, wouldn't it? As opposed to a treatment injury caused by a non-doctor. Interesting. So really we do have an obligation to help, don't we? Unless we are inebriated or too tired.
Yeah, and we can help when we don't have an APC or when it's outside our scope.
Interestingly, this was some very long time ago, I think, in my time with MPS, where a doctor did receive a complaint because they drove away or walked away from someone collapsed on the side of the road, and a member of the public recognised them as a doctor and the fact that they did not assist.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I can't remember what happened in
no,
that case.
that was a case that I assisted with. I remember
Was
that
it?
now. Yeah, I can't, but I think it was very close to a medical centre, and there was a situation where actually there was somebody available closer and more appropriate to attend. I only have vague memories of the case, but I do.
The get out clause.
Yeah, there was There was one of those get out clauses. Okay, so I think we're clear that in New Zealand, doctors have an obligation to help with a medical emergency. But what if the outcome's not good? What if it's bad? How are we going to be judged? If it's an ophthalmologist who's providing care for a multi-trauma victim in a road crash, will they be judged on the standards of an ophthalmologist in that situation? Or will their care be judged as substandard if they don't do what an ED consultant would have done in that situation?
Yeah, I think the Medical Council says that the care you provide should be of a reasonable standard and skill. But really, you should only be judged on the standards of your own scope of practice. And, for example, the HTC wouldn't expect a neurologist to have experience in putting in chest drains, which might be needed in an emergency situation. But I think they would expect that the neurologist, if they were acting outside their scope, would check that there were no other more reasonable options available, or maybe see if they could get phone advice from an ED colleague.
Yeah, that do no harm principle still applies, doesn't it? You can't just get in there gung-ho and have a go. But I can imagine that it would be a very tough decision to put a chest drain in for a patient with a tension pneumothorax if you've never done that before. And you would have to be sure that there wasn't any other option and the patient would, have a worse outcome without it. Don't know what you think about that, about putting chest drains in on the side of the road, but...
Well, I think the practicalities are that you wouldn't have much to actually stick a chest drain in with. Maybe a biro. I've heard of biros being used to pocket knife at a biro. And I guess if you're absolutely convinced that the patient was about to die, and you're really in a critical situation, then reasonable to try. But I don't think you'd be criticised for not doing it if you'd never done one before and had no idea what you were doing, because as you say, it would.
I think the situation I'm thinking about is that coming across a car accident, quite often there may be local ambulance crews that haven't got paramedics in them, and that the ambulance can turn up, and you're a doctor, so there's equipment there, but not a paramedic. I have had that situation. And, it's all very well putting in lines, but I have to say, if I've been asked to do anything more than that, and in fact, in that situation, I actually got my husband to put the line in. I
assume he's a doctor.
He is a doctor. Yes, that's lucky, isn't it? So, I think there can be situations where you have got equipment, but not necessarily the scope of practice to use it.
I think it is around the urgency of the situation. Is the patient about to die if you don't intervene? Then I think it's better to try. Obviously, look, I put a chest drain in maybe 30 odd years ago. Could I do one now? I think if I had to, I could make some kind of an attempt if a patient was going to die. So I think it comes down to that, doesn't it? It depends on the urgency of the situation and the level of skill you have. But I think it's a really good idea, if you can, to phone someone and get help over the phone, because they can talk you through how to do it.
Yeah, that's true. So the other question here is about our indemnity and your Medical Protection Society indemnity when we're providing help in an emergency in a situation that's outside our normal scope of practice. Because our indemnity obviously only normally covers us within our own scope of practice. So what about that poor neurologist that's putting in a chest drain?
Well, good news, because in fact your MPS indemnity would cover you for the situation. It's quite clearly a Good Samaritan Act, and there's actually also the Medical Council statement saying that you're actually expected to help and do your best. It's an obligation to do so. And so MPS recognises that and says, yep, sure, it's outside your scope, but you're doing your best, and sure, we'll look after you if there's any consequences for you.
So as we're coming to the end of this podcast, I'm just thinking we haven't actually said what is considered a Good Samaritan Act. What's the definition of that?
All right, well, look, we define a Good Samaritan Act as one in which medical assistance is given free of charge, importantly, in a bona fide medical emergency upon which you may chance in a personal as opposed to a professional capacity. So if you're a doctor walking down the corridor of your hospital and you see someone who's collapsed, that's actually professional capacity, and that's not a Good Samaritan Act. But if, as you were, Lucy, driving and come across a car accident, that's definitely a Good Samaritan Act, because you weren't driving as a doctor, you were driving as an individual person.
So the situation I think we often get questions about is actually, what about if you're attending the rugby match as a team doctor, even if you're not being paid? Are you a Good Samaritan then?
I don't think so.
Yeah, and that other one is the child school trips, which we often get calls about. If you're asked to act as a doctor on a school trip and you're there to provide medical services, is that a Good Samaritan?
No, I think if you've taken on the role, even though you're not getting paid for it, I think that would be seen as not a Good Samaritan Act, because you can foresee that you're going to be called upon to provide some kind of service. And to be honest, it's never a good idea to offer to be the doctor on a school camp or any kind of school trip. I've done that before.
Why not? What, dealing with vomiting children, is it?
Look, it means no sleep ever.
Right.
So I'd just say no right from the start.
And I think the key here, if you go back to the definition, is whether you're acting in a personal or professional capacity. If you've agreed to be the team doctor, then that has to be a professional capacity. And so therefore you can't then call upon the Good Samaritan aspects of providing care.
So that means if you're acting as a team doctor to get cover from your indemnifier, you have to stay within your scope of practice.
Yes.
So the ophthalmologist being the team doctor and then providing musculoskeletal care isn't within the scope.
I'm not sure why an ophthalmologist would want to even
be a team. Okay, fair enough.
But yeah, no, that's right. I don't think MPS would cover that, because clearly outside of scope.
Okay. All right.
I think the other hook, isn't it, is whether you get paid to do it.
Yeah, and certainly we would advise members that if they have provided help in a medical emergency, for example, on the plane between Auckland and Dunedin, not to accept vouchers as a gift from the airline, because that could potentially be perceived as accepting payment, in which case the Good Samaritan cover may not be available to you. When we come to talk about international travel, I think if the airline offered you an upgrade to business class, I think that would be perfectly reasonable to accept that and not regard that as being a payment for your services. But it's certainly there should be no perception that there's a payment and therefore it becomes a professional service as opposed to a Good Samaritan Act.
Although if they offered you a gift after the fact, I would have thought that wouldn't be perceived as payment for services as such. So therefore,
I don't know. The advice is generally is we should say don't accept something. But having said that, I've done this wrong, because I have been called on a flight on the way to Paris, and they did actually offer upgrade, and I think we got a voucher or something for some food thing, and at the time I wasn't aware, and I have to say I didn't accept the upgrade, but I got a voucher.
Well, luckily nobody knows about it.
Nobody knows.
Except whoever's going to be listening to this
Except I just
podcast
told
now.
everybody. But it was more than 10 years ago. There must be a statute of limitations on it. But,
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. That the chances of anybody finding out if you did get a small gift for a free meal or something like that is incredibly small. So I don't think MPS would cease cover on that basis. But you probably want to keep that kind of thing more to yourself, Lucy, than what you're in the habit of.
I think in New Zealand, if you do your Good Samaritan Act in New Zealand, that if something untoward happened to the patient and you actually caused harm, the patient would be compensated under ACC treatment injury and therefore wouldn't be able to sue you for personal damages.
Yeah, so that does make Good Samaritan Acts in New Zealand a safer scenario, doesn't it, for our members, because you're not going to get sued here. And if an ACC treatment injury would cover for any problems. Okay, so I think that might be a good point to stop here. This is a bit of a shorter podcast than normal, but look, in our next podcast, we'll be thinking a bit more about what happens when you go overseas. And we're also going to touch on the issue of providing medicines to expeditions going overseas, or for maritime requirements when a ship's captain asks you to prescribe for their medical kit. So thank you for listening to this podcast. I hope it's been helpful, and we look forward to catching up with you in our next podcast. If you like the Medical Protection Podcast, please subscribe and leave a review. If you would like a podcast on a specific topic, please email us on nzpodcasts@medicalprotection.org. And thanks, Sam and Tim.
Thanks, Lucy.
Cheers, Lucy.